we are good to go and start coding our create Rastasian endpoint in order to feed our database with some entries now to make it possible. Alright, so we want to somehow use our endpoint, pass in some values for a Rastasian entry, and these values will be inserted in our database. Which means we need to somehow feed some data into this function. First of all, I'm gonna add the database argument to this function because we will need it to basically run the insert query, and then afterwards I need to specify a variable that will hold whatever our consumer will pass into the endpoint. Let's see, we have our create Rastasian endpoint, which is this one, but with method post, and the way to pass in the values to this endpoint with the JSON format. First of all, we have to specify the content type header, which means that whatever data we pass in this endpoint, it is in the JSON format. And then after we have this header, which in any case it is required by this format JSON attribute up here, we also need to specify the JSON itself, right? The way to do so with curl is with this -d argument, and then in here we can write our JSON structure. So when creating a new Rastasian, we want to basically only specify two things, basically name and email. ID is something that is auto-incremented in the database, so it will be generated by our database during insertion, and created at is also something that can be generated by our database. Remember, we specified down here in the migration that by default this will receive the current timestamp. So it is a good idea to let the database handle this for us, and then we don't need to add any extra logic on that. And yeah, that basically means we only need name and email here. So let's call our Rastasian John again, and John Doe, and then the email will be simply john@doe.com, and then we expect that this entry will be passed into our endpoint somehow. So the way to do this in Rocket is by specifying one more argument, and then up here in the post definition we need to declare that the data that come from this endpoint will end up into this variable. We will name it here new Rastasian, and then we will use the same up here, new Rastasian, and then this new Rastasian needs to have a type, right? We are passing it as JSON, so this will be JSON value, but here we also need to specify the type of the JSON, because CRD will try to somehow parse this incoming JSON into a Rust data type, which means we need to define a struct here, and then we will reference this struct in these brackets. We could use the Rastasian struct, but remember, our new Rastasian data here are not one-to-one matched to this Rastasian struct. This Rastasian struct has also ID and created at, which means that we should create a new Rastasian, a new struct, a new Rastasian struct. We will call it new Rastasian, and then it will just have name and email, nothing else. Simple as that. And then we can put this new Rastasian struct into here and have CRD translate the JSON value to that. The compiler is complaining because it cannot find our new Rastasian struct. We can include it up here, new Rastasian. There we go. And then again it will complain because we need to specify a trait or on our new Rastasian struct, the deserialized CRD crate. So we want to deserialize JSON into this struct. We need to derive this trait exactly like we did for the serialized trait in Rastasian. We need to do the opposite, deserialized trait for new Rastasian, because we are receiving new Rastasian into our API. So the API is deserializing JSON into new Rastasian, whereas Rastasian we send it as a response to from our API to the consumer. So from Rastasian we convert it to JSON, so we serialize it. Small difference, semantics, but yeah, let's see if the compiler now is satisfied. Okay, looks like it is. All good. We can now proceed with the implementation. And the implementation, of course, we can get rid of this hard-coded value and basically use our database with the run method like we did up here, and the list Rastasians endpoint, get Rastasians. And then we have to, of course, await this async function and also switch our endpoint function to an async one, and then we can start defining our callback and passing in the SQLite connection. Alright, and now that we have the SQLite connection, we are ready with trying to insert in our database. The way to do so with Diesel is we use this Diesel insert into method, and we need to specify the target here. The target is going to be our Rastasian table, of course. What else? Okay. And then we need to specify the values. And the values for this insert statement will come from up here, from the data that we receive from the endpoint from our new Rastasian JSON value. Okay, so we need to pass new Rastasian here, but not exactly new Rastasian, because new Rastasian is the JSON value right now, whereas Diesel expects a new Rastasian struct directly. So we will call this into inner function that JSON value has, which basically unwraps what it contains and passes it further down to values. And then afterwards we can execute by passing in the connection, the SQLite connection. And at this point we should expect some kind of panic or some kind of weird database behavior, and in case we have something like that, we will again panic, which, yeah, it is something temporary. Like always, we should never panic in Rust. We will handle it later along with our panic up here. But yeah, the message can be failed inserting new Rastasian entry. Alright, and then we have the query result. So let's assign it to a variable here. Let's call it result, and then let's return this result to our consumer. This result, of course, will not be what our consumer is asking for. Usually when you consume an endpoint, a create endpoint, what you expect after you run the call, the HTTP call, you expect the inserted entry to be returned to you, along with a new ID and whatever, the entire record. You expect it to be returned to you so you can further use it in your program and further consume it. Here, what Diesel will return us is the number of affected rows, which is probably useless for our caller, but for now it is good enough. We will just use it to make sure that our insertion worked, and later we will refine it and return the entire record. Alright, so the compiler now complains for some reason, and because we need to implement yet another trait for our new Rustasian struct, the insertable trait. So that's a way that the Diesel will be able to basically use this struct as an argument to an insert query, like we did with the queryable up here. We now have insertable for new structs, and then we have a problem with yet another problem from the compiler. Of course, it complains that it cannot find the new Rustasian crate, which this error is a bit misleading, because it tries to guess in which table it should insert this struct to. It doesn't know, but we can help it. We can basically tell it manually. Table equals table name, actually, not table, and then equals to Rustasians. And yeah, we need to wrap it in brackets. Like this. Of course, now it complains because it cannot resolve Rustasians, because our Rustasians table name is stored in schema. So we will import it, use super schema Rustasians. So yeah, this one will refer to the Rustasians struct from schema, and yeah, now it looks like it doesn't complain anymore. Finally. Okay, and then also no complaints here, so let's try to run the assertion on the endpoint. I will open another terminal and compile the application. Great, no complaints here as well. So yeah, basically let's try this. And look at that, it looks like it works. It returned us 1, which makes sense since we have one affected row. Let's try it again. Okay, it works. Probably now we ended up with the same panelist twice in our database. But let's find out actually. Let's see. We can use our Rustasians endpoint and see how many Rustasians we have right now in the database. Remember, before we only had actually we had nothing. We had an empty array returned. Oops. The terminal is misbehaving a bit. There we go. Okay. I will hide this window. And yeah, our get Rustasians endpoint lists us exactly 2 Rustasians, which is exactly what we expected. We have 2 John Doe Rustasians, one with ID 1, the other one is ID 2. And yeah, the created add values, you see they were successfully generated, that they were just a few seconds apart each. But yeah, that's overall great. We have now both our create rest and endpoint working, and also we just verified that our get rest also lists everything correctly. Great. But let's try one more thing. Let's try one to see what happens if we try to create a rest to use the create endpoint, but we are missing the email, for example. What if our request is is partial, so we don't have everything that we need? Will we crash or okay? Looks like an error, which is a lot better actually. We have an HTTP error of 422 unprocessable entity, which is actually a really nice thing, and also a very nicely put together error, which explains that our request was well formed, but yeah, it contains some semantic errors. By seeing that, we can easily understand that we are missing something. We can see further details if we go in the logs from Rocket. See, Rocket provides some insight here in the logs, so it tells you exactly the reason. Missing field email. It tried to parse this payload, but email is missing, so we are responding with 422. It didn't find any catcher, so it will use the default one, which is in HTML, something that we can improve on. But yeah, overall, our program works great. We have our endpoint working, and the error is not that bad. It could be worse. Very nice for the first approach. Let's move on with the rest now.